All right, hello everybody. Tonight we are going to talk about community ecology. Community ecology refers to all of the populations in a given area. So a population is a group of the same species, and if you put all of the populations that live in a given area, that's called the community. The structure of a community is measured and described in terms of species composition, so who lives there, and then species genetic diversity, how biodiverse is that particular community. All right, part of talking about communities is talking about succession. So this is sort of a side idea, but I want to go through this with you to make sure you understand it. Succession is the idea that ecosystems age, and as they age, we see organisms that arrive at the beginning of when the ecosystem first arrives. That sounds funny, I'll explain. And as the ecosystem ages, we see different species arriving in this ecosystem. So what does that mean, an ecosystem ages? Well, an ecosystem has a starting point, just like the planet had a starting point. So for example, after a volcano, there's now a new ecosystem. We have nothing but rock or lava. There's no seed, there's no soil, there's no plants, there's no animals. And over time, and it might take hundreds or even thousands of years, we form all these different ecosystems on this lava field. So succession is the process of these pioneer species that come in first, hence the name pioneer, and they live and die and live and die and live and die on the soil, on the lava. And their bodies, in essence, form the soil that starts to get thicker and thicker and thicker as they live and die. So pioneer species include things like lichens, which are these crusty things that live on rocks, small plants, mosses, that kind of thing. And as they live and die and live and die and live and die, the soil starts becoming thicker and thicker. And as the soil thickens, then we can have larger plants, grasses, and perennials. And as the soil continues to thicken, we can have larger plants like trees or shrubs. But now we have to start dealing with shade. As shrubs and trees come in, they start shading the soil. And so some of the original species that needed sun, they can't live there anymore. So their populations start to diminish and new populations replace them. And so they have these new niches. And so eventually you end up with a climax community. And the climax community is the community that is most persistent. It's often shade tolerant. So like the trees that drop their seeds, the seeds can grow in the shade of the parents. So they can still survive even though the parents are shading them. And that climax community persists. It stays that way. I mean, they live and die until there's a disruption. And a disruption might be natural, like a fire or a tornado or a flood. A disruption might be human, like bulldozers or us burning down or cutting down the trees. So moving on. We go. What happens after a fire? So take a look at the diagram. The diagram now says secondary succession. So here's an example of a fire, but it could have been some other event that caused the ecosystem to basically have to start all over again. But what's interesting about secondary succession is that I want you to notice that there's already soil present and there's already seeds present. So if you take a look at the timeline down below, secondary succession happens much faster. Still the same process. There's the shade intolerant plants come first. They're the pioneer species. And then over time, shrubs and trees come, they produce shade, and those pioneer species disappear. But it happens a lot faster than it did in primary succession. All right, so now we want to talk about ecosystems, the diversity within this community. So there's two factors that we're going to talk about that define or decide whether a community is biodiverse or not. The first one is species richness. Species richness refers to the number of varied species that occupy an ecosystem. So if you take a look at the two diagrams, we have community 1 and community 2. They actually have the same species richness. They both have 4 different species. The other part of biodiversity is called species evenness, and it sometimes has another name, but we'll go with species evenness. That's the number of each species that occupies an ecosystem. So if you take a look at community 2, you notice that the majority of the trees are that light green deciduous tree. And so they have different biodiversities. We're not saying one is necessarily better or worse. The one on the right has less biodiversity because it's got so much of that particular one green tree. But we're going to calculate that, and we're going to calculate that using something called the Simpsons Biodiversity Index, and we'll do that in just a moment. So the idea with all communities is that the biodiversity is good. Biodiversity gives stability. If there's a disease, if there's a pest, if there's a predator, and we have biodiversity, it's less likely to damage the entire ecosystem or the entire community. So farms, interestingly enough, are what are called monocultures. They are the opposite of biodiversity. They require enormous amounts of energy to stay monoculture. They're completely unstable. So in this case, we've got this farm down below. It requires herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers. And if a disease arrives, it spreads through the whole field super quickly because they're all clones of each other. In essence, they're all the same species. Or if a pest arrives that likes to eat that particular crop, it's going to spread through the crop because there's only one crop there. There's only one species. The picture above is a palm oil plantation. The entire diverse rainforest that used to be there has now been replaced with just this palm oil plantation. And same thing, it's super destructive. It destroys ecosystems and places for all these different species to live. And so we have very low biodiversity. So these are called monocultures. All right, so Simpson's Diversity Index is kind of a tricky little math thing that we need to work on. I'm going to show you how Simpson's Diversity Index works, but then we'll have a worksheet and a little activity that we'll do to try to practice so you feel comfortable. This particular equation is on your equation sheet for the AP exam. So it says the Simpson's Diversity Index determines how biodiverse an ecosystem is. Small n represents the number of organisms of a particular species, and then big N, just like it did in our population dynamics notes, big N represents the total population of all the organisms in the species. So the index ends up with values between 0 and 1. So a higher value, maybe you have a 0.89. That's a high biodiversity and very stable ecosystem. There are many niches in the ecosystem, and there's very little competition. A low value, maybe a 0.2, would indicate low biodiversity, and it may indicate an ecosystem with a few dominant species, like we saw in that other image where there were lots of the light green trees, and a greater degree of competition. All right, so now we're going to totally switch gears here, and we're going to talk about community relationships. There are 5 types of community relationships, 5 primary types, which is really surprising because you look at this picture and you're like, oh my goodness, there's so many different organisms, and they seem like they have so many different relationships. But really, there's 5. The first one is competition. These are organisms that are competing directly with one another because their niches overlap. Now, to be clear, the word niche can be pronounced niche or niche. I was taught niche way back when, and I always stick with niche. It feels like niche is snobby when I say it, so I'm going to say niche. If you like niche, I don't care. All right, so what is a niche? Well, niche, you can use it in not talking about ecology. You can talk about it with a business model. Someone's business niche refers to their little pocket of the consumer world. They have figured out what consumers want and nobody else offers it. When we're talking about an ecosystem or a community, we're talking about where the organism lives and who it interacts with. And so that's its niche. And so what foods it eats, where it lives, who it mates with, how it communicates, those are all part of its niche. And when the niches overlap, so for example, the vulture and the sandfox here, they're competing for the same piece of food. And in that circumstance, their niches are overlapping, and that's what's causing the competition. So the interesting part here, there's many interesting parts, is that competition is actually bad. Species don't want to compete with each other, so they want separate niches. There's no way this sandfox and this vulture want to be fighting over the same piece of food. They both wish wish the other wasn't there. It's bad for them because they don't get as much food when they're competing with each other. So there's two types of competition. The first one is called interspecific competition, and that refers to competition between different species. So that's like the vulture and the sandfox. There's also intraspecific competition, or conspecific. Con means with or the same species competition. And that would be like two vultures or two sandfoxes competing for the same piece of food. Competition forces survival of the fittest, and that's what leads to evolution. So that sounds like that's a great thing. But remember, these guys, they don't want to be competing. They'd be much happier. They would lead full lives if they didn't have to compete with one another. All right, and then competition leads to a whole bunch of other things. So this term you might not be familiar with is called competitive exclusion. And that's when the species have overlapping niches. They actually, one of them outcompetes the other and one of them disappears. And so that's called competitive exclusion. Even though they could both survive in a particular area, only one of them survives and the other is forced out. So the example that we have here are diatoms, which that's a picture of what diatoms look like. They're super cool, come in bajillions of different forms. They are photosynthetic algae that I heard it's like they have walls made of glass. That's what I've heard. So their cell walls are made of silica, which is what glass is made of. So pretty cool. If you take a look at the graphs here, let me get my image out of the way. We have a laboratory experiment where diatoms are given an environment that has plenty of silica in it. And so if you look at the first graph, you see the Asterianella it's using the silica in the environment. So the silica is going down and the Asterianella is increasing in population. And you see that nice leveling off as it hits its carrying capacity. All right, and then we, in a different aquarium, we are growing the Cynedra, and we see that it's using the silica in the same way. Its population levels off just like the other one. However, if you put both of them in the same tank together, you see them competing initially, and then we see that the Asterianella is not able to survive. It's not able to compete as well. And we see that the Cynedra ends up surviving independently of the other one. So that's an example of competitive exclusion. All right, other things about competition that you need to know. Give me a second to get that out of the way. There we go. I want you to understand the difference between what's called the fundamental niche and the realized niche, and this is due to competition. Take a look at the experiment before I explain those two things. So in real nature, so to speak, we see along a coastline, we see these two different types of I suddenly forgot what they're called. Oh my gosh, I forgot what these animals are called. Well, anyway, barnacles. There we go. Why did that name skip my head or just jump out of my head? I'm really sorry, guys. Okay, barnacles. We see some barnacles that are high on the cliff's edge, and we see some barnacles that are low, a different species of barnacles that are low. And it appears upon first observation that the ones that are up high like being up high, and the ones that are down low like being down low. However, if we experimentally remove the balanus, what we find is that the other ones take over the entire side. They were only up high because they partitioned the ecosystem. So it's called, give me a second, niche partitioning, which means that they sort of agreed to live up here and the others agreed to live down there, so that they could both survive in a similar area, so that their niches didn't overlap too much. They partitioned them. And you can see the same thing happen with these species of anole, these little lizard species. They all live in the same ecosystem, but they tend to live, like some of them live on fences, some of them live in the leaves of the trees, some of them live on the trunks of the tree. They have partitioned up the niche so that they are not competing with one another, so that they don't have to fight over the same resources. All right, the next type of community relationship. So number one was competition. Number two is predation. Everybody knows what predation is. When one individual, the predator, captures, kills, and eats another individual, the prey. All right, predation has led to diverse adaptations like cryptic coloration. You probably have heard it called camouflage. I love this picture down below because this fishy is so camouflaged. I think it's awesome. Mimicry, which I think is another really cool one. This is a snake, and this is actually a moth larva that looks just like a snake. This is an actual, this is called a cuckoo bee. And the cuckoo bee, this is a different type of mimicry, sorry. The cuckoo bee and the yellow jacket look like each other because they're both stinging insects. So that's an example of a type of mimicry. This one is a type of mimicry where this guy's totally harmless, but he looks scary, so birds avoid him. These guys, I shouldn't say purposely, I imply that they're intentionally mutating to look like each other. It's not intentional at all. However, it's effective when the mutations make them look alike. If a bird has learned, avoid yellow jackets, then guess what? The bird is going to avoid the cuckoo bee also. And they are both stinging insects that the bird wants to avoid. So those are both examples of different types of mimicry. This is called Batesian mimicry, and this is called Müllerian mimicry. You don't need to know that, just FYI. All right, the next one is called aposematic or warning coloration, and that's what you get with the poison arrow frogs. So that's those bright colors to identify that they are poisonous, or that they would make that they would sting, for example, or that they would make the predator ill. And then other things that count as predation that or have evolved because of predation: thorns, poisons, and irritants in plants are things that have arisen because of predation. All right, now we're going to talk about the last three of the five community relationships, and these are called the symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic or symbioses talk about organisms that live in or on each other. So it's super, super close. Like a lion and a zebra, they're not living in or on each other, so that doesn't count as a symbiotic relationship usually. Some people will say that is, but usually we don't say that is. So if you take a look at the diagram here, this wasp its offspring are living in or on the caterpillar. And so that's why that's a symbiotic relationship. So the first one we're going to talk about is parasitism. It can be really, really gruesome. You'll have to watch these videos. I'm not going to show them in the middle of this video. So the parasite derives its nourishment from a second organism, the host, which is harmed. The cordyceps is a fungus that takes over sort of the mind of different insects and causes them to do bizarro things. So that's a really fascinating parasite that you should watch a video about. And then parasitic wasps, that's what you're seeing here. And there's an interesting video about that. Pretty gruesome, just warning you. The next symbiotic relationship is mutualism. This is where they are mutually beneficial. They're helping each other. So the pollinators and the flowers are getting food from the flower, and the flower is getting their pollen transferred from one flower to the next. So that's how they reproduce. So they're helping each other out. In the middle, we have something called mycorrhizal fungi and plants. What you're seeing is on the root system down below, there is this fungus that is incorporated into the root system. And the fungus actually helps extend the root system and helps pull nutrients out of the soil, and then it feeds the nutrients to the plant. Awesome, right? You lucky plant. In return, the plant photosynthesizes and it delivers some of its sugars, some of its carbohydrates to the fungus down below. And so they're helping each other out. And it's a fascinating relationship too, because we have mycorrhizal relationships all over forests and what have you. And when we cut forests down, we actually cause the mycorrhizae to die. And then if we try replanting the forest, it takes longer because it's more difficult for the trees to be able to absorb what nutrients are there. It takes them a long time to absorb them because they don't have that mycorrhizal fungus to help them. All right. And then the last of the five symbiotic relationships or community relationships, there are three symbiotic, there are five total. It's called Commensalism. And this one is fairly rare. You don't hear about this one very often, and it's a word that most people forget. It refers to one species benefiting from the interaction while the other is unaffected. An example here is the golden jackal and the tiger. The tigers don't care at all about the jackals. They go, they hunt, they're independent, they eat whatever they want. And then when they're done with their food, they leave. And the jackal scurries in behind and nibbles on whatever leftovers the tiger left behind. The jackal is benefiting from that relationship, and the tiger couldn't care less and probably doesn't even notice that the jackal's around. And so it's not benefiting or being harmed. It gets all the food it needs and it moves on. The jackal is benefiting from that relationship. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about, and you absolutely have to watch this video because it is a beautiful, beautifully done video. These are called trophic cascades, and they've been documented all over the world. Really talking about the importance of predators, which we did not appreciate until, boy, within the last 20 years or so, how important predators are. So trophic cascades, oh, I forgot to put quotation marks around it. This is a quote. Trophic cascades are powerful indirect interactions that can control entire ecosystems. Trophic cascades occur when predators limit the density and or behavior of their prey and thereby enhance survival of the next lower trophic level. Okay, that's a lot of words, and once you watch the video, it'll make total sense. But the classic example, and perhaps the first place, I don't know this for sure, perhaps the first place that we really identified trophic cascades or really became common knowledge about trophic cascades was in Yellowstone National Park. Gray wolves were hunted basically to extinction. They were exterminated in Yellowstone because people were afraid of them and they would kill the cattle and all kinds of different things. So they got rid of the gray wolf. What happened over time, and no one was really paying attention, but the ecosystem of Yellowstone started to change. The elk were no longer being hunted by the wolves, so their population started to increase. As the elk population increases, we see certain trees and certain plants start to disappear or become less common because the elk are eating them. The elk are living in certain areas because they're bold, because there's no wolves to hunt them. And it has just this cascading impact throughout the entire ecosystem of Yellowstone. But then in 1995, they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, and the impact was dramatic. Pretty much as soon as they brought wolves back to Yellowstone, the wolves started hunting the elk, and the elk freaked out and they ran away and they moved to different locations. And so now these locations that had been overbrowsed by the elk had a chance to regenerate. And so there's trees that didn't used to be there that are way bigger than they ever used to be. And it even affected things like the shorelines and how the rivers were meandering. It saw a huge increase in biodiversity once the wolves were there. All kinds of different organisms started to be able to thrive and do better in Yellowstone. So that's a trophic cascade. So we have to appreciate our top predators, and it's an interesting story. Definitely have to watch the video. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.